Wuhan is the only level 4 laboratory in all of China. So that's where you would put a dangerous pathogen. Whether you were genetically engineering it to be a weapon or not, that's where you would be experimenting on it. So it makes sense that the epicenter of the epidemic, that the lab there would be the source of that virus.
Stephen Mosher was the first person we heard say that. Very few honest people would disagree at this point.
China covered it up for months. It doctored the data, saying that it wasn't as infectious as it actually was. They silenced whistleblowers. They lied to the World Health Organization repeatedly. We should have been ready for it. China, again, communist China is the great breeding ground of pandemics. When we first heard the rumors of a new and deadly epidemic spreading in China, I was intensely interested. As the head of the Population Research Institute and a longtime student of the Chinese language, history, and culture, I had been following events in China for decades, first as the first American allowed to do social science research in China, living in a Chinese commune for a year, exposing the atrocities of the one-child policy. And later, as a founder of our free radio broadcast service to China, I was on the commission that set up Radio Free Asia. I've also been invited to testify before Congress, the House, and Senate on a couple dozen occasions on China. I've written books on China. So I was intensely interested in what new danger, what new problem had arisen in China. I was qualified to do so not only by my background in Chinese studies, but also because I have an advanced degree in the biological sciences. I'd gone to the University of Washington and got a bachelor's and a master's in same, was about to get my PhD when the Navy that was subsidizing my research had other ideas and sent me to Japan. From there, I went to the Chinese University of Hong Kong and learned Chinese. So both the biology and the sinology were interesting to me when I began to look at the origins of COVID. Looking into the origins of COVID, of course, got me canceled fairly quickly, got me banned from social media. It did get me on Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingram's show a couple dozen times. It also led me to write this book called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics, because I had reached a number of politically incorrect conclusions after months and months of research. I learned that while deadly plagues have ripped across the globe for centuries and probably always will, that COVID-19 was unique in the annals of plague history because it had originated in a lab in the city of Wuhan in central China. It was a result of bioengineering. That's one reason I was canceled. I also found that most of the deadly plagues in human history, from smallpox to the bubonic plague to various viral plagues of the last century, had also found their origins in China for reasons that I will soon explain. China, as Francis Gasquet said way back over a century ago, is the great breeding ground of epidemics. That's a politically incorrect statement, of course, but it happens to be true. Life under the COVID-19 pandemic was very, very different than it had been under plagues of the past, in large part because we had modeled our response on China's response. And so overnight, virtually overnight, open, free market democracies turned into tyrannical dictatorial states, surprising everybody, I think, including the bureaucrats who sent down the orders, people like Dr. Anthony Fauci. Surprised that the American people, known for their love of freedom, would sheep-like follow them into lockdowns, isolation, masking, school closures, and all the other nonsense that did little or nothing to stop the spread of the pandemic. I also found out in the course of my research how the Chinese Communist Party and China itself had profited from the release, the deliberate release, the conscious release of a deadly pandemic upon the world. I came across Chinese Communist Party source documents showing that for years and years before 2020, the Chinese Communist Party's bioweapons experts and the People's Liberation Army had been talking openly about weaponizing coronaviruses. And of course, what we were dealing with during the pandemic and are still dealing with today to some extent is indeed a coronavirus. And of course, I learned over the course of my research how long-standing rules governing public health, how the planned pandemic response was simply thrown aside in favor of a Chinese model of pursuing the fantasy of COVID-0. Now, I don't think this pandemic has turned out to be as deadly as we were all told. We can talk about the numbers in later episodes. But one thing this pandemic makes clear is that this, in all likelihood, will not be the last genetically engineered virus that will be released upon the world. We know that the People's Liberation Army bioweapons experts have a huge coronavirus and viral collection effort going on right now. And we suspect, I suspect certainly, that lurking in a test tube somewhere is the next generation of deadly viruses that have been genetically engineered, lurking in a test tube now, waiting for release at the right time in the future. So the next pandemic may be the most devastating plague ever. Of course, if we panic in the same way we did during the coronavirus pandemic, it certainly will be. Let's go deep back in history, just for a few minutes, to talk about the first plague that we have been able to identify in human history. Not surprisingly, it occurred in China 5,000 years ago. In North China, there's a village now known as Hamanmaga. About 3,000 years before the birth of Christ, something happened in that village that left everyone in the village dead. There were, when Chinese archaeologists began to excavate the village, they found several dozen homes, which were all empty, except for one. In the very center of the village, stacked up 2 and 3 and 4 layers thick, in a single 14 by 15 foot room, were the bodies of over 100 victims of some catastrophe. The bodies had not only been stacked up, they'd been burned. And after considering a number of different scenarios, including earthquakes and warfare, the Chinese anthropologists concluded that the large death toll was probably a result of a deadly pandemic that had raged across northeast China over 5,000 years ago. What plague could it have been? Well, there are several possibilities for the disease that caused it. We know that Chinese scientists are as yet unable to give a clear answer to this question because of the fact that only the bones of the victims were left and those bones were burned, so there's no surviving genetic material. It could have been smallpox, it could have been the bubonic plague, and of course it could have been a viral epidemic. Smallpox, of course, we know from the treatises written by practitioners of traditional medicine, was known in China and treated in China with a treatment called variolation over 2,000 years ago. So it could have been smallpox. It could have been the bubonic plague because even today in northeast China, Chinese hunters will kill and eat marmots who are carriers of the flea that carries within their tiny bodies the plague bacillus. So it could have been the bubonic plague, or it could have been some viral epidemic. So we don't know the actual cause of the disaster in China. We know that other villages have since been found deserted, with the bodies stacked up and burned in the same way. So it wasn't just an isolated event. It apparently raged throughout northeast China. The first plague in human history came from China, which, as Francis Gasquet said in his book about the Black Death of 1348 and 1349, said China is the great breeding ground of epidemics, and indeed it is. So it is perhaps fitting that the first plague that we know about from human history, as well as the last plague, the one that we've been living through over the last several years, came from China. History, of course, is largely the story of man's inhumanity to man. From Cain and Abel to Herod's slaughter of the innocents, from the Aztecs' cannibalistic slaughter of neighboring tribes, to the Chinese Communist Party's elimination, annihilation of 500 million of their fellow Chinese. The death toll from violence that men have inflicted upon other men is staggering. But while natural disasters have also taken a heavy toll on the population, all of these causes of death, I think, pale in comparison to the death toll from the tiny killers that have cut a major swath through humanity. Until recent times, of course, half of all children born died of disease before the age of 5. Human lifespans were limited to the early 20s. So viral and bacterial plagues have plagued mankind from the very beginning. Many of these pathogens have probably coexisted with humanity from the very beginning of time. But of course, we are also bombarded with new pathogens, with so-called zoonoses, which is to say viruses or bacteria which have infected animals for perhaps millennia, but have managed to mutate into something capable of infecting a human being. The majority of these microbes, these zoonoses, do not cause massive death and destruction. They cause mild symptoms. The diseases they cause usually do not reach epidemic proportions. The pathogens themselves die out after infecting and sickening a village or two or a province or two of people. They are self-limiting. But a deadly few, smallpox, the bubonic plague, and certain respiratory viruses, have proven to be both infectious and deadly to peoples and to economies and to empires. They've left the survivors too weak to resist the barbarians at the gates or even to bury the dead. We're living on a plague planet. The only thing different about the plague that caused the COVID-19 pandemic is this. The pandemic that followed the virus's release from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, like the virus itself, was the first man-made pandemic in the history of the world. Unfortunately, what we've learned about the Chinese Communist Party's bioweapons program tells us that it will not be the last.